So to show off masks, I will go ahead and open a texture. And this is a texture that my friend Gary Bergeron took here in Austin, Texas. And you'll notice here it has 3 channels, RGB, and then the RGB combined. So to make a mask, I'll go ahead and clone this. And the background, I'll go ahead and fill it with black. To fill a layer, you can just hit Alt-Delete, which will do the foreground, or Control-Delete, which will do the background. So I'll go ahead and do Alt-Delete to make it black. And to create a mask on here, all I want to do is hit this Create Mask button down here. And so you see, put a little box here next to it with a link, and then also put it here in the channels. So if I select my brush and go in and choose just a basic brush, and I paint in here, you'll notice nothing's happening because my foreground color is white, and white keeps it 100% visible. So to quickly change between foreground and background, I press X. And this is something that my hand hovers over all the time, and I just quickly press X so I can take away and add. And the good thing about a mask is it's completely non-destructive. And I'm a huge proponent of not destroying your textures unless you're absolutely sure that you no longer need it. This can save a lot of headaches later, but most importantly, it can help you iterate on ideas that you think will help improve the texture or the texture combinations. That way, you can try something really fast, see if it's working. If it's not, you can easily go back. So if I pick something more of a noise brush, let's see here, something like this, and make it a little bit bigger, press X, you'll notice that it's a little bit more organic. So let's pick something a lot more organic, something like this one. So you can see how it's revealing the black underneath it. Now black's not too interesting, so I will go ahead and clone this level, and the best way to do it is just drag it over this new, and it makes another one. And to delete a mask, I'll just drag it to the trash, and I'll say delete instead of apply. If you hit apply, it'll actually delete the texture parts. So I'll drag this here, and if I move this texture with the move tool, you'll notice that it's moving and revealing the mask underneath it. So I'll create a little edge there. So to quickly see what it's like with the mask off, you hold down Shift and click the layer. So basically that's a quick way to just toggle a mask on and off to see exactly what it's doing. The link here links the mask to the texture. So if I select it and move, it's going to move the mask and the texture at the same exact time. But if I turn the link off and then move the texture, the mask stays in place. Or vice versa, if I select the mask, just the mask will move. So here, if I select my brush again, you can see whenever trying to blend 2 textures together, that I can press X, add, take away, to get something where the seam is not visible. A practical application of this would be as if you wanted to remove this crack. So if I move this texture to where the crack is, go back to my mask, and paint black by hitting X, you'll notice that I'm removing the crack, but it's also showing the other crack. So what I'll do is I hit Control-T, which goes into a transform mode. And in this transform mode, you can do various things like if you right-click, you can scale, rotate, skew, perspective. But for now, I just want to flip horizontally. That way the crack's over here. And I'll hit Enter to apply it. I'll go back to my mask, and I'll get rid of this crack as well by adding the foreground layer back. Just by hitting X over and over, I finally get something to where there's no crack on either side. Now this one seems to have a pressure sensitivity for opacity, and usually that's not the best thing to use because it will have a lot of in-between grays blending the 2 textures, which can kind of look a little muddy. Sometimes that's alright, but other times it's better to use something that just has size. That doesn't really give enough irregularity, so I will try another brush. Alright, so that's basically a mask, but let's say you wanted to place a texture in that mask instead of painting it. Well, one way to do that is I will hide this and I'll create a selection. Select the layer that has the selection and the texture that you want, and hit Ctrl+C for copy, and then go back to this layer, select the mask, go down to where the mask is visible, turn off the RGB so we're just looking at the mask, and hit paste, Ctrl+V. And essentially you have pasted that texture into the mask. So now go back to RGB, and you see it's really a lot of gray values, so most of the time when I do this, I try to adjust the levels. So I'll go Image Adjustment, Levels, or Ctrl+L, and I'll get more of a black and white range, so you can see there's a lot less gray in between. So you can toggle preview to see the before and after. So you can move this mask around and see how sometimes it can save you a lot of work instead of having to paint that mask. And it's good for just adding some random organic detail that will help break up solid textures or blend two textures. Another thing I would like to go over is layer blends. So for now, I will delete the mask and delete this other layer. And you'll notice that my texture is back the way I had it originally, so nothing was destroyed. But layer blends, as you can see here, you have dissolve, darken, multiply, and so on. There's really only a few of these that I've ever used. Some of them are interesting to see the results, but they're not very practical for what we're doing. So let me open another texture by double-clicking the empty space, and I'll choose this oily texture and drag it into my scene. I'll go ahead and make it a little bit bigger. Now, a lot of times I want to blend this onto the background, but I really just want a lot of the darks, so it can look like this oily detail is on the surface of the rocks. Now, in this case, where you're trying to do dark and light values, it's good to use a multiply. So the multiply projects that black onto every pixel of the layer beneath it. But you notice since these colors aren't absolutely white, it really does just darken everything. So a lot of times you'll want to use your levels again by hitting Ctrl+L to get rid of those grays and get it to where you're just getting the values that you want. But you'll notice how there's a lot of hard edges and stuff, but so this would be a good time to put a mask and just with a noise brush quickly get rid of the details. Let me choose a different brush until I find what I'm happy with. So you can go in, erase a few. You can see how it's a nice and complements the details in the oil texture itself. So you can add, take away, just get something that dirties things up. And sometimes you have to move it to really see what's left. Go ahead and remove some more. Alright, so you can see how I just darkened that. So multiply is very common and is one I use most. So let me close this. Another one would be screen or color dodge. Color dodge is one I use a lot when I want to add artificial highlights into my scene. And what I mean by that is I'll make another layer and I'll set it to color dodge. And I'll paint details where I kind of want to accentuate some of the highlights to give contrast. And contrast is very important in games to help things become noticeable. So if I just paint the black, you'll notice that nothing's happening. The black is actually getting painted, but a color dodge really only takes light values and adds them to the surface. So if I choose a white, you'll notice that a white almost always is way too hot, so it blows things out. So what I like to do is I like to pick a middle gray to in the upper range and paint that. And this is very similar to an old technique people use, which is a dodge and burn tool. The dodge dodges the pixels and makes them brighter. And a color dodge is very similar, but the good thing about using in a layer is, once again, it's non-destructive. So you can see, let me delete all of this. And with gentle application, you can add highlights to certain things, especially metals. In this example with the rocks, you probably wouldn't use it very much. But similarly, if I add another layer and also choose a gray, but a little bit lower into the darks, and change it to multiply, these two layers are very nice for adding that extra contrast and bite into your scene. So whenever you add the highlight, sometimes you'll want to add a dark spot underneath it. And sometimes with this multiply, you can also sample a dark that has some color information instead of it just being solid black. So this is almost like incorporating an old school technique into next-gen texturing. In the old school ways, you would actually paint in all of your specks and your shadows into the diffuse because you would only have a diffuse texture. But with next-gen texturing, a lot of that depends on your specular map and normal maps and how the light will bend across the surface. You don't necessarily want to paint highlights and shadows into your texture because the real-time lighting or the baked-in lighting in your game engine should take care of this. However, I have noticed if you paint a little bit in, it will help accentuate what the game does itself. And this can help add a lot of good contrast and make your piece look a lot more interesting. Okay, so I'll go ahead and delete those two layers. A few more layer blends. I'll go through and check some more textures. So here's a rust texture. And the reason it gave me that error is because I tried to drag onto itself, but you can't do that with a locked layer. So instead of dragging onto yourself, I'll drag it into the scene. And I'll hit Control T and I'll hold down Shift so it'll uniformly scale the texture up. And I'll hit Enter. Now, if I change this layer blend to multiply, you'll notice that it also brings the color information with it. But if you choose overlay, which is also a very popular one as well, it's also going to bring in the darks and the lights. But you'll notice that the lights are too bright, so a lot of times you need to Control L and adjust some of these levels to get something you like. A lot of these decisions can be really subjective, and there's really not a lot of hard, fast rules, but basically overlay and soft light are very similar. Soft light does very similar, but it seems to do it a lot less intensity. I end up using soft light a lot just for adding a little bit of breakup in my texture by using another texture. Let me go ahead and open up another one here. Let's see. We'll pick this concrete. And usually I select it, and you can roll your mouse or press down to go through the different modes. Darker color is interesting. It will basically replace the color with this if it's darker. The good thing about darker color and even darken is it doesn't try to blend a lot of the values in between. It's more this texture or that texture. So it can preserve a lot of the pixel detail instead of muddying it up. Another interesting technique that a lot of people use, but I've never really gotten used to, is if you double click a layer over to the side here, you'll notice you have a lot of blend options on that layer. Now, one thing I do use for normal maps is a lot of times I'll uncheck blue. That way it won't blend the blue when you're overlaying normal maps. But in this case, if you use the blend if gray, you can clamp this value, and you'll notice the farther I go here, the more I remove some of the darks. The good thing about this technique is, once again, it doesn't do any blending. It's really this pixel or that, the top or the bottom. So it preserves a lot of the details. Similarly, if you use the white, you'll notice it kind of gets rid of the whites. but to me a lot of times it makes it a little bit too grainy. And I like to use the masks because I have a lot more control. I kind of like painting in my own or using textures. So same thing here is the same thing, but it's going to pull the texture underneath instead of using the texture on top. So if you want to just start bringing in these cracks, you can get a good start by just doing that, which looks pretty interesting. Or if you want to use the highlights, you can do the same thing and just put this in the cracks. I can see this being useful when wanting to put grass in the cracks or something like that on a terrain texture. But this is another option and it's fun to experiment with. So if I go back through some of these and see what it gives me, you also have the lighten and the lighter color, which is kind of like the darken and the darken color. And hard light really does, it almost does like a overlay, but it really takes the darks and the lights values in much more intensity. So you'll notice how it's bringing these light values deep into the dark. Vivid light, it's very rare that I use this, but sometimes it can be interesting because it adds a lot of color. It seems to multiply each color channel or something. I'm not sure exactly what it does, but subjectively it can give some interesting results. Linear light, pin light, hard mix difference. Sometimes you may just want to bring in the hue or the color of one texture onto another. And why you may want to do this is maybe you want to break up the entire saturation of all this. So you'll choose color, which this one really doesn't have much color, so it looks desaturated. But if I was to hit Control U, which brings up hue and saturation, you can change the colors of that texture just by changing it like this, or you're adding saturation or changing the lightness values of those pixels. I don't really like doing this too much because, once again, I destroyed the original. Instead, I like using these adjustment layers. But I'll go over adjustment layers in a second. So with this, if I was to add a mask and paint in some details, you'll notice that it kind of breaks up that yellow color. I'll go ahead and delete this. And I'll change this back to normal. I really don't use a lot of these, so I really won't go into a lot of details, but darken, multiply, darker color, lighten screen. I'll show you what the screen does. Screen basically, all it does is lighten the values of these pixels with the pixels underneath it. So it looks at the value of each pixel and adds it to the value underneath. So if I adjust my levels a little bit and make the texture a little bit darker, you'll notice how some of those pixels are so dark that it doesn't do anything. So we're just getting a lot of the brighter values. And that's pretty much it for these. We'll be going through a lot of different ones throughout the DVD, but I just wanted to kind of set a foundation to help understand this as we go. So I'll go ahead and delete this for now. And I'll delete this one. One other thing I'd like to go over here is, instead of applying a hue and saturation on a texture and thus destroying its original state, a lot of times I'll use this little thing here, which is called adjustment layers. And you can do a lot of things in here with levels or with hue and saturation. So a lot of times I'll add levels and it brings up the levels dialog box like we were just using before. So I'll go ahead and brighten this texture up a little bit, hit OK. And you'll notice that it's on its own layer, so I can hide it and unhide it. The good thing about the levels is it also has a mask. So you can paste the texture in there, or with the brush, you can remove some of the levels. So if I paint in some of these darks again to give that variation and bite of contrast, it's easily achievable. Same thing with hue and saturation. If you want to break up the color of this, you can just go into, you find something that's interesting, like maybe a dull blue, hit OK. And instead of white, we'll fill this with black by hitting Alt, Delete, and paint white by hitting X, so the white's in the foreground here, into some areas to kind of break up some of the yellow. And I'm using a brush so the harder I press, the more intense it is. That way I can press very lightly and just get a little subtle variations. And I'll press X a lot to bring it back and then remove it again. So adjustment layers are very nice because once again they're non-destructive. Go ahead and delete those. And that's pretty much the basics for masks, layer blends, layer styles, and so on. Next, I'll go through making this texture tileable and really nice techniques to make that process fast and enjoyable instead of really tedious.